This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents The Day the Sky Fell, written by Barry Charman and produced by Steve Blizin. Where were you when the rain came? I was driving home when I saw a woman standing by the side of the road. Her face was streaked with red. I stopped and let her in, asked if she'd been attacked. She said it was raining blood. I drove to her place, cautiously, the windshield wipers nervously spreading streaks of blood across the glass. It was coming down much harder now. She let me in. We sat in the kitchen, wondering when it would stop. The voices on the radio were distant and alarmed. The faces on TV were pale and unnerved. There were no answers. Nothing like that. Everyone was on a knife edge, waiting for something. I slept on the couch. Amy, that was her name, came down in the middle of the night and lay beside me. She shivered, telling me the blood had been drizzling against her window. I self-consciously put an arm around her. She was in her mid-20s, I guessed, about 5 years younger than me. Her blonde hair still had red in the roots, where she'd failed to wash the rain out. She asked me to stay, and I hadn't wanted to leave. The next day we stood at the window and stared outside. The rain had ended. At first, we thought it was snowing. I realized before she did and told her not to go out. She wouldn't listen. She was excited. Snow was pure. It would wash away the blood. She went outside. I didn't follow. I froze, refusing to contemplate what I was seeing. When she came back in, there was something white in her hands. Her eyes were darting about. She was not holding snowflakes. They were feathers. Her hands turned into fists. I tried to calm her down. Eventually, she let the feathers go and watched them drop. She turned to look at the snow outside, then ran upstairs, too troubled to speak. I stood at the window, my thoughts slowly turning over. A strange, dense mist was forming. As I watched it roll in from nowhere, the whole garden was quickly consumed by it. Shortly, nothing could be seen of the world outside. Not the feather-strewn lawn, not the blood-smeared flowers. I stared and stared. I found Amy upstairs, lying on her bed. She was on her side, staring at the window. I wanted to distract her, so I sat beside her and told her about my small life and little hobbies. Anything was better than silence. Then something crashed. Outside, near and far, everywhere, like a clap of thunder that soared to violent applause. The volume was terrifying, overwhelming. Disoriented, we collapsed to our knees. My hands were clutching at my ears. I tried to remove one and extend a hand to her, but had to instantly replace it. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Shaken, we picked ourselves up, our ears ringing. The sound, brief but infinitely jarring, had come and gone. The silence it left was dreadful, even if it wasn't immediately clear why. Everything was done slowly. It took a lot of time to get downstairs, a lot of nerve to go to the front door. A lot of fear was dealt with before my hand was put on the handle. I didn't know what to expect, but something had happened. We felt that in our bones. Fearful, curious, I opened the door. All I could see was the thick, heavy mist. I had to see what had happened. I had to know. Amy followed me out. We quickly clutched for each other, terrified of becoming separated, losing the only people we had. We walked through the mist, needing to find something we could make sense of. Possible shapes were glimpsed in the distance, but they would be trees or walls, or just disappear before we reached them. There was nothing ordinary, nothing natural. We walked on. We had to. There was no finding our way back in this. We called out to people. At first we offered help, but soon we were asking for it. What had happened? Where was everyone? Why was everything so silent? It was stupid, really, that neither of us had noticed our deafness. Maybe it was the ringing that we still suffered from after the crash. Maybe it was the deafening quality of the silence. But it was a while before either of us realized. We pawed at each other in panic when it finally hit us. Her panic helped to subdue mine, and I put my hands to her face and stroked it, mouthing soothing words. I hoped she would understand. The phrase, "It's okay," sat in my mouth, and I framed it over and over again. I thought we just needed to wait. Something would change. Either people would come or our hearing would suddenly return. Then, of course, I realized everyone else would be affected, and that there was no help. Both of us were deaf, and we were calling to the deaf. Good God, just what was this? I could never have guessed. Eventually, we found people. They had been outside when the crash had occurred and looked at us with horrible, profoundly disturbed expressions. They knew. The first people we approached just retreated, overwhelmed, appalled. There was a terror to them that was beyond reaching. Moving on, we met others who were just sitting on the curb, cradling their skulls as though inside there were infants weeping. Some had seen, some had felt. Others had no idea, but were simply affected by everyone else. And everyone was affected. We walked on, hand in hand, unable to do anything else. Eventually, we met another man. He was signing frantically. I didn't know any sign language, nor did Amy, but we both realized the source of his distress. He had been deaf already when the crash happened. Seeing everyone stagger around in a terrified parody of his own condition had greatly unnerved him. He was pleading with us, hands moving in a blur, lips working in a murmur. What has happened? We looked sorry, but we could give no comfort, so we had to look away. Walking, we met people who were wandering in confusion everywhere we went. Some had stumbled half-dressed from their homes. Some were calling soundlessly for children and lovers. Amy saw a small boy alone. She gestured to me, and we went over to him. She tried to speak, and the boy tried to listen. He made faces that were unbearable to see. Eventually, he pulled away from us and ran into the smoke, the mist, gone in a second. I held Amy's hand. Looking at her, I saw she was crying. I wiped away her tears and thought for something hopeful to say. I'd never been good with words, never having the right ones for the right moment. Suddenly, I comprehended that there were no more words, and almost laughed. But then I realized there was no more laughter. Can you laugh if no one can hear you? I wiped her tears and held her hand. Then, I kept us moving. It was a nightmare, really. The world had become a strange, delusional place. No sound, no reality bar the immediate mist. Everything felt like a dream. I knew I wouldn't wake up, and in a way I didn't care. If I woke up, Amy would be gone. It was then I embraced the dream that kept me going. It was probably what kept us alive. I don't know what other people did that day. There must be a million tales. I can't even imagine how terrified some people must have been, or how strong some others. That first day. How many didn't make it past that first day? We broke into a house. Then I raided a fridge and made us some dinner. Both of us were slowly calming, exchanging odd little gestures. We read each other's lips as best we could. We were scared. Everything we knew had somehow ended, vanished. But we wanted to endure. We wanted to survive. Probably, we thought things would be better in the morning. The next day, I was a little surprised to find myself still deaf, but not so much that it did me any real harm. I think I knew the damage was done. Strange how sometimes you can adapt to something. Just absorb it and carry on. There were those who would adapt and those who would not. I realized that well. The mind helped you to cope with the most extraordinary of things. I held on to this, to the idea I might be more capable, more durable than I'd ever imagined. Amy had slept in the next room, and when I woke her gently, she stared up at me and tried to say something. She couldn't hear herself speak, and the previous day flooded over her like she was a dam made for tears. I made her breakfast. She came downstairs and sat opposite me in a stranger's kitchen. Her long hair was tied back, and she looked different. She seemed practical, ready, determined to hold on to whatever she could. She had a notebook and pen and wrote, "What do we do?" This is what we did. We each had family, friends. The idea was to work together, rally all the people we knew, stay together, stay safe. The subtext of all this kept something of the world we knew alive. We found some rucksacks, filled them with food, then left to go back into the mist. Outside, the world was unchanged, all the same silent shroud as the day before. It was like falling asleep and falling back into the same dream. We had debated through furious scribbles whether we should steal a car or try to find mine, but we knew that these conditions had rendered the roads unthinkable. Despite this, as we walked, to the name nearest on the little list we had compiled, which turned out to be Amy's mother, a car hurtled past us. Neither of us had heard it coming, and it scared us witless. The driver, whoever he was, had no chance. Not only was he blind and deaf, he was clearly terrified. He was just going on and on until he got away from what was happening, or until he was killed. It occurred to me that I had instinctively assumed that everywhere was affected by what had happened. But I didn't know this. I had nothing to base this on. Yet even then, I knew the mist wasn't going to clear. We weren't suddenly going to emerge back into an unmarked world. This was too big. Too much. When we got to Amy's mother's house, we found nobody there. Amy took it well enough. She had seen the panic-stricken people yesterday. We had seen few of those today. Her mother was out there, somewhere, trying to find help. Maybe she found it. Maybe she didn't. Amy accepted it because she had to. She wanted to survive. So we waited a while. Then Amy left a note, and we kept moving. Sometimes I would look up and see a small gap in the clouds. In between heartbeats, I hoped the gaps would multiply, that the blue of the old would return and the sky be healed. But nothing changed. Often the mist was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So we held hands. We kept to the pavement. When we rested, we scribbled down whatever jokes we remembered to cheer each other up. Sometimes she wouldn't know she was crying, and I would wipe away her tears, and vice versa. We never saw the police or the military. There were no flashing lights to pierce the mist and reassure us. No paramedics or men in quarantine suits. Sometimes we saw bodies. Sometimes they were covered. Sometimes they were stripped. But we saw nothing that spoke of an order beyond the chaos. The longer we went without order, I guess the less we needed it. We met a group of people who were tied together into a sort of desperate chain. A man at the front was leading with an expression of grim determination. The chain was stumbling and sobbing, but he wouldn't let them rest. Like most we met, they were gone as quickly as they had appeared. One time we tried to break into a house and found that someone had bricked up the windows and doors from the inside. They were building walls within walls, anything to keep the world out. I wondered how long they'd waited before making that drastic decision. The 10th day? Or had it been the 1st? We'd lost track of time. It had become impossible to measure. Even night was only marked by an increase in the pressure. Strangely, The loss of time affected me worse than anything else. The unreality surrounding us became more intrusive, more pervasive, as if it was leeching from me something so basic that I only now feel violated. Ahead of us, a huge cobweb-like scaffolding structure emerged from the mist, erected around a tall building. We found a group who were trying to build upwards. They wrote an explanation for us. They wanted to get to the sky, to break through. We stayed with them for a couple of days, curious, fascinated. They were a mixed bunch, different ages, backgrounds. They used the scaffold as a bridge to relate to each other. They all wanted to understand. We sat with a man and his wife. She was pregnant and constantly held her stomach as though the kicking in her womb was the only thing she dared believe in. We all wondered if the child would be able to hear. And what would it hear? We discussed this through scribbles for as long as we could, but the idea that there was something around us that we couldn't hear, it was too much for any of us. A pile of scrunched up notes lay around us as we tried to sleep. A nest of prayers and ideas, introductions and theories. Above us, the scaffolding was comforting. It was man-made. It was new. Things were ongoing. New things were still possible. When they got high enough and one man went up to see what he could, we all waited with bated breath. He came down and just shook his head. He didn't look disappointed, but then he had probably expected the worst. The group began to break up, so we left it before it felt like we were abandoning it. I walked away with Amy, her hand in mine. Our fingers were locked tight, a sign of that lingering fear that we could be separated, even though we knew nothing could easily separate us now. Some days later, we came across a circle of kneeling shapes. Men and women, eyes shut to the world, heads bowed. At the center of their circle was an old Bible, and next to that was the Quran, the Torah. Their lips were all moving, whispering or pleading, praying or accusing. We stepped around them, unheard and unnoticed. I was strangely afraid of them, of what they might see if they opened their eyes. Were those who were not in the circle to blame? Were they blasphemers? What sort of person was not in the circle, invoking answers from God now unreachable? We avoided them, leaving them behind us as quickly as we could. Soon we'd left the houses and then the cities behind. We found ourselves walking down an abandoned highway. I wanted to say how calm it was, how peaceful. I looked at Amy and saw she felt the same. This was like a lull in the madness. The mist seemed softer, the world further away than ever. Then we came upon a collision. I made Amy stop and wait while I looked closer. The drivers were dead behind their wheels, looks of shock and confusion still readable on their faces. The doors were all open. The cars were carcasses picked clean by New World vultures. The only thing left was a teddy bear on a back seat, showered in glass. A present, perhaps, never to be given. No one had touched it. It was kept in place, cradled by a frayed seatbelt. I couldn't look for too long. I went back to Amy and shook my head. We agreed silently to get off this road as soon as we could. This would be one of many stories, with too few endings. We found our way back to the streets, which blurred into each other as we wandered on. Breaking into random houses, we lived as best we could. Sometimes it struck me, as we wrote our thoughts and exchanged them by candlelight, how honest life was now. How simple. Without words, we entrusted something to silence that was special, new to us. We kept moving. The list was our guide. Each name we crossed off was a link severed to the past. It haunted us, yet liberated us, directed us. Once we finished with the list, what then? We needed to find people. We needed supplies. We needed to make a future out of these ruins. We tried to join up with a few people, but some groups were too large and intimidated us. Some were too small and erratic. There's a lot of violence in the survivors we found. It was a snake uncoiling in their guts. It was a maddening thought pacing in their minds, a hand twitching with yearned for but undeveloped actions. There were signs we'd come to quickly pick up on. Some people were bitter, lost, confused. They were not moving. They were waiting for terrible acts to manifest themselves. We kept moving. Occasionally we saw footprints that were red from having run through blood. We didn't need to think about those things. We just needed to keep going. It must have been the 8th or 9th week that we saw the body. At first we thought it was an ordinary man, some poor person who'd been mugged or attacked. We took a closer look, and that's when we first began to accept what had happened. Where were you when the sky came down? Were there bodies? Were there many? It was larger than a normal man. Its skin was a strange bronzed color. It was beautiful, naked, and sexless. Horrible jagged wounds scarred its back. I stood there for a while, contemplating this latest piece of the jigsaw. I looked up at the mist around me, at the hidden, wounded sky. What could do such a thing? And what did it want? We couldn't continue, so we broke into a nearby house. This one as abandoned as all the others. That night, as we lay together for the first time, we tried not to think, not to understand. We surrendered ourselves completely to the present and to each other. It felt good. I untied her hair and felt it tumble through my fingers. Stroking it as a sensation made her smile. There would always be moments like this, I thought, and that alone could bring you peace. In the middle of the night, I woke up and felt Amy beside me. Sometimes I would remember sounds from my dreams and be disturbed by the reduced world around me. But feeling her close just made me feel relieved. I thought back to that first night. I remembered a tedious drive abruptly ending with the sight of her, alone and frightened in the bloody rain. I smiled sadly for that other life and the simplicity of it that I sometimes only barely remembered. Thirsty, restless, I got up and walked downstairs. From the window in the hall, I glanced out and saw some sort of commotion. I wondered if other people had discovered the body. How would they react? I looked out, eyes desperate to pierce the pale, veiled world. Nothing. Moving to the front door, I opened it slightly. I was maddened by my loss of hearing, frustrated by the clouded view. But as soon as I opened the door, one of my other senses was suddenly overwhelmed. An odor assaulted me, rancid beyond anything I had ever smelled before. Gagging. In a single second, I was on my knees, tears and bile streaming from my face. I looked up, distressed, and saw inhuman shapes clustered around the body we had discovered earlier. They were not of its kind, or ours. They shall go undescribed. You will know them by how your body rejects them, and by how your mind refutes them. They cast sick shapes in the mist, and they are feeding, always feeding. As they ate of the body, I quietly closed the door. I wondered if I understood something now, or if this was not worth understanding. I never conveyed what I'd seen to Amy. We kept moving, ticking off the final names on our list. We traveled by what we thought was the day, and we hid at night. We saw fewer people with each passing day. Sometimes we saw the sexless bodies. No matter how much time had passed from the crash, they seemed unchanged. They didn't decompose. Their beauty didn't falter. They just lay there as though stunned, with delicate expressions of surprise perturbing their soft skin. Some people we came across had taken to collecting these bodies, storing them. They would surround them and pray, as if thinking they could be made to wake up. At this point, the only people you met were the ones with big ideas. By the time we completed the list, we'd found a few people, old friends and new, that fell in with us, happy to have any direction other than the restless waiting or endless fear that had kept them alive but alone. Amy was never quite sure why we had to keep moving, but she trusted me. Perhaps she sensed I had been different since that night, that maybe I'd seen something. Maybe she had seen something, but didn't want to worry me. Whatever it was, we trusted each other. We held hands and we never let go. On and on we went. Sometimes I saw the creatures or just their work. Once I broke into a house and found one inside. I couldn't get away before it saw me, but it didn't care. It just leered, and as its twisted lips smacked together in what might have been laughter, I was strangely haunted by a sound I didn't even want to hear. The house was dark. I never saw it fully, and I was glad. On we went. The mist, no. The cloud never cleared. The silence was never broken. Everywhere the same, on and on. Where were you when the rain came? When the sky came down? When the end came quick? And did you make a new beginning?
For more information, including pictures and videos of the stories told on this podcast, please visit creepypod.com. If you'd like to submit a story for consideration or recommend a story, please see our submission page at creepypod.com/submissions. All stories told on this podcast are done so through Creative Commons Share-alike licensing or with written consent from the authors. No portion of this podcast may be rebroadcast or otherwise distributed without the express written consent of the Creepy Podcast production team and the story's author.
The Bloody Disgusting Podcast Network, home of Creepy, for disturbing and terrifying creepypastas. SCP Archives, with full cast storytelling. Horror Queers, genre commentary from the LGBTQ perspective. The Boo Crew, for horror-centric interviews. Listen free wherever you stream audio and at bloodydisgusting.com/podcasts.